Okay. Well, hi everyone, and welcome to the last fall webinar. And today we will be welcoming Dr. Mallory Melton, who will be presenting her research about plants in Guatemala. Before we get started, while we meet in a virtual platform, we would like to acknowledge the importance of the land that we each call home. So from coast to coast, we respectfully acknowledge the ancestral and unceded territory of the Inuit, Métis, and First Nations people who call this land home. We also wanted to let you know about some of our upcoming activities. So in January, we will change the format a bit and we will have an interview with Dr. Justin Jennings, who is curator of the Americas at the Royal Ontario Museum. And in February, we will resume with a talk from Dr. Carla James Betancourt from the University of Bonn. We also would like to let you know that CLAAS Notes Volume 4 is soliciting submissions with the deadline of February 1st, 2025. And we accept abstracts, field notes, and short reflections, as well as articles. So please consider submitting to CLAAS Notes if you want to disseminate about past or current fieldwork and research. And you can email us or visit our website if you have any questions about this publication. Hola a todos y todas y bienvenidos al último webinar de este otoño, donde contaremos con la ponencia de la doctora Mallory Melton, quien nos contará su proyecto de investigación en Guatemala. Antes de comenzar, mientras se van uniendo los participantes a la reunión virtual, nos gustaría reconocer la importancia de la tierra que cada uno consideramos y llamamos hogar. De costa a costa, reconocemos con humildad y agradecimiento el territorio ancestral y eterno perteneciente al pueblo Inuit, Métis y primeras naciones cuyo hogar es esta tierra. Os contamos nuestras próximas actividades, ya que el próximo mes, en enero, haremos una entrevista al Dr. Justin Jennings, curador de las Américas en el Royal Ontario Museum, y en febrero tendremos una conferencia que será impartida por la doctora Carla James Betancourt de la Universidad de Bonn. Y pronto os daremos más detalles de estas actividades por correo. También informarles la fecha de entregar sus trabajos por CLAAS Notes volumen 4 es el 1 de febrero de 2025. Y aceptamos 3 tipos de entregas: resúmenes, notas del campo y artículos académicos. Por favor, consideren contribuir a nuestra publicación sobre sus planes del campo y comunicaciones de sus investigaciones. Y pueden buscar más información sobre CLAAS Notes en nuestro sitio web o pueden enviarnos un email. Y ahora le paso la palabra a mi compañera Alexa, quien presentará a nuestra invitada.
Thank you, Ariane. Gracias. I'm very pleased to have the opportunity to introduce Dr. Mallory Melton, who's an expert in the analysis of macrobotanical remains, starch, and phytoliths from archaeological contexts. Her research is centered in the Americas with projects in southeastern North America, Mesoamerica, and the Peruvian Andes. As an anthropological archaeologist, work has primarily focused on using plants to study the impact of sociopolitical change on daily life in middle-range and complex societies. The transformational settings that she studies represents microcosms for the interplay of aspects of foodways, practices surrounding processing, cooking, disposal, etc., and other social fields like prestige good exchange that are more often studied as indicators of stratification and complexity. She's published over 10 articles and book chapters in venues such as Latin American Antiquity, and the Journal of Archaeological Science Reports. She's published various technical reports that have been prepared for clients affiliated with academic institutions and private corporations. She comes today to communicate her research to us, our community of scholars and interested folks in Latin American archaeology, titled A Botanical Perspective on Social Relations at the Middle Preclassic Urban Center of La Blanca. And we welcome Mallory to begin her talk.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for the kind introduction, Alexa, and for inviting me here to speak with you today. I'm super excited. So the research that I'm going to be talking to you today started as my dissertation research and is currently being worked up into a book for University of Texas Press that I'm super excited about, with the tagline Lessons, Learning How to Feed the Masses. Excuse me. So it's all about lessons that we can learn about food security and these incipient urban spaces and how they may or may not serve us in the future, in our very uncertain future to come. So it's reporting on this research and reflecting on the bigger potential of archaeology to answer some of these pressing questions, which is something I think we all are focused on in our research, making it count, making it matter, and making it relevant to people beyond just our small region and area. So I want to begin this talk by, of course, thanking all of these wonderful people who have participated in excavations over the years. So I had the great pleasure of joining a project that had already been in progress for decades. Michael Love began excavations at La Blanca in the 1980s, and before that at Shook excavated at La Blanca. And those excavations went on intermittently from the 1980s up to 2017. And I participated in the project in 2016 and 2017 field seasons. Believe it or not, throughout that entire time from the 80s up into 2017, the people who were working with us in the field were principally came from the Ramirez family. It was one local family with tons of folks who had become, over the years, really well trained in archaeology. So they joined us, and they have just become such great assets to the project. And it's been such a pleasure working with a project that has so much data by the time that I came on. Even if the botanicals had been looked at, and Debbie Pearsall and her students had looked at some of the botanicals before from the previous excavations. So it gave this great roadmap and foundation for the work that I was going to do in 2016 and 2017. So it's just been a great pleasure. In addition to doing all of this, we've been able to train students from Guatemalan universities, bringing them onto the project, and that's just been a lot of fun. So to think about the framing of how I situate my research in a broader context, one of the things that I think about is the beginnings of population aggregation and urbanization. And there's a lot of ways to look at this. You could look at the drivers for urbanization, what's causing it. You can look at the aftermath of that process. How does disintegration happen? How do cities break down? But one of the things that I've really focused my research on is the social lives of cities, a la Monica Smith and others. And I've really focused on how do households engage in food production, and how does then food production link and create networks in between households to articulate social bonds that may not come across in other material traces. They may not come across in jade distribution and obsidian distribution. How does food uniquely comment on the bonds formed between individuals? And then what can that tell us about the social fabric of the city and the degree in which social differentiation might be expressed within the city? And it's one of these criteria that have come to the forefront in our studies of ancient urbanism, social differentiation as an expression of an urban way of life. Because especially in the Americas, not all cities fit in with this blueprint that comes from an old world background, this blueprint of having an extremely large population, having very dense centers. Often when we talk about urbanism in Mesoamerica, the term is thrown around low density urbanism. But how might we look at cities that don't fit this old world mold and start to pick apart ways in which they can express urban qualities in their own light, ways in which they might be creative, innovative, and even more interesting than the models that we might try to fit them within? So food is a really excellent mechanism or a proxy for looking at these social relations between households and between groups. And I don't feel like that claim is particularly revolutionary. Certainly it comes on the backs of lots of other archaeologists who have come before me in laying out these connections. But one of the things I think I should highlight is that we have to eat to survive, right? So food produces a really robust material record of interactions between individuals, exchanges of materials, labor integration, and also expressions of connection, meaning, and association. Food brings people together, both in the past and in the present. And the food technologies that we use have a way of connecting people, even when they're long gone. So this is Doña Aura, who works with us on the project here on the right. And she's actually using a mono metate combination that was passed down for generations. These pieces of everyday foodways really do become incorporated into our lifestyles and become part of this social fabric through which we construct our lives. And this connection between the past and the present, certainly between ancestors and the living, is something that has gone on in Mesoamerica for quite some time. And I'll talk a little bit about that relationship in the Middle Preclassic towards the end of the talk. So when I talk about the Middle Preclassic or the Middle Formative Period, or even the formative period in general, and to clear up some terminology, for those of you who don't work in Mesoamerica, we typically call the formative period this all-encompassing term for this preclassic segment of time, but one that's not Maya dependent, whereas preclassic is connected then to that classic Maya chronology. It's two ways to say very similar things. So when I talk about the Middle Preclassic, it is coeval with the Middle Formative Period, if you've heard of that. So around this time, a culture that you may have heard of are the Olmecs, and Olmec really being an art style, right? It's expressed in the Gulf Coast of Mexico. Today, we're going to be talking about the Pacific Coast on the other side of the landmass. And we'll be talking about principally this area right on the coast of Guatemala, where La Blanca is, but I'll also talk about a couple sites in Mexico. So to lay out the historical chronology for you so that you understand what's happening socially by the time the Middle Preclassic rolls around, I'm going to lay out some basics. So by the early Preclassic, the center of power is really Mazatlan, Mexico and Chiapas. It's right across the border, and we do have some emerging chiefdoms by that time. The first inklings really of social stratification and differentiation in this area. People are also clearly engaging in horticulture, as seen through sediment cores and archaeological assemblages. I'll talk a little bit about the archaeobotanicals from early preclassic sites in a bit. By the Middle Preclassic, we have the first inklings of urbanism and urbanization. People are coming together in these more populous settlements than ever before. And on the Pacific Coast, La Blanca epitomizes and is a key example of this agglomeration happening, of these people coming together and living in a grand scale. We also have very good evidence from the site of social stratification across households, whereas nearly every household has jade. It's pretty easily accessible on the Pacific Coast in comparison to the Gulf Coast. Some households have more jade than others, which provides a really key sense, at least, of economic stratification between the different households. So that's just one index that we use. Another one is quality of house construction, and among other things, quality of fine ware ceramics and where they're concentrated. But to know by this point, Mazatlan has become, is no longer a center of power. The Pacific Coast is emerging as one, and urbanism is happening. In the late Preclassic, we get the emergence of the first states. One, actually, El Ajuste, emerges just less than 20 kilometers away from La Blanca. So we also get Izapa, other states further afield like Kaminalhuyu emerge. And we get the beginnings of this really keen sense of institutionalized leadership. We get public presentations of things like bloodletting and events that are centered on elite prestige. So you can see how the Middle Preclassic is this really fascinating transitional period, that's really fascinating change. And it makes for a really nice case study for examining how we go from things in the early Preclassic to this elite emphasized, differentiated, uh, institutionalized late Preclassic. So zooming in on the Pacific coast, I'm going to talk about La Blanca principally. This is indicated by the red square on the map, but I'll also talk about some contemporary sites like Guatemala, which will be a nice middle Preclassic comparison. There's plant data from that as well, and they were analyzed by actually my advisor, Amber Vanderwerker. Other sites have been subject to paleoethnobotanical analysis, Paso de la Amada, among others that I'll talk about from the early Preclassic. I was one of these centers in the Mazatlan in that early Preclassic period. So La Blanca is not alone, it doesn't stand alone, and certainly the Pacific coast was a populous area in the early, middle, and late Preclassic periods. So I want to set us up by thinking about the ecology of the region because it plays a key role in thinking about the power of doing this sort of research and the kinds of expectations we might have for the plants that would be identified. So if we look at the Pacific coast, it's this very thin band, it's a little hard to see, this very thin band of dry forest. And you'll see that most of Guatemala, this is a map of Guatemala with these forest regions indicated. Most of Guatemala is very humid forest or humid forest. And this is what we typically think of when we have a vision of what Guatemala looks like. Think of sites like Tikal or La Corona being in these jungly regions. But La Blanca is this really special opportunity to study these dry forests, to understand their composition. And you may think, well, aren't they still around? But the situation today is very different than this native forest range would indicate. And part of that is due to the ability to grow crops very, very well in this region. So it's become a real cash crop empire kind of place. At one point it was maize, at one point it was sugar, right now it's plantains. But if we look at where La Blanca is, and this is as of 2012, the modern forest coverage, that previous map was our native forest ranges, what should be native to there. This map is these modern coverage, what is there right now, or at least as of 2012, 10 years ago when the survey was done. You can see that La Blanca is in an area that is described as no forest. So not only is it a low amount or kind of sparse, there's nothing according to this survey in terms of forest existence. Now that doesn't mean there's no trees growing on the site. I think that's an underestimation. But certainly any evidence of this type of forested landscape is not as lush as it used to be. It's not even an area where you've got a lot of dry red mangrove forests. There are some nearby, of course, but the dynamic is certainly different. And this is what it looks like today. So this is part of the site and it's covered by plantain fields. You can see these beautiful volcanoes in the background that people would have inevitably seen during the Middle Preclassic. And in fact, the largest mound, Mound 1, might have, I'll show you a picture of Mound 1 in a bit, might have been made in the image of some of these volcanoes, like a man-made volcano in and of itself. But as you can see from these photos that I took when we were doing the excavations, the forest coverage, or let's say less managed type landscape, is quite sparse. You can see that there's palm trees in the background, but most of it is an agricultural landscape. Now, that doesn't mean that everything's gone. There are still groves of trees and small pockets of native flora that exist in home gardens. And we'll talk about that and the important role of home gardens in the future of this area that they could play in bringing back some of these native species, or at least encouraging their growth. But first, how did I go about finding the things that I found, and what did I find? What kinds of things might we want to continue planting in these home gardens? What kinds of things might have been in this region? Because as you could see from the previous photo, there's not a whole lot to go on in terms of a local botanical survey type thing. And when I first went out to the site, I thought, oh, I'm going to find like a great footprint and blueprint. And that's not what I found. But it creates a lot of potential for archaeology contributing to the story of what kinds of things are growing in the area, of what the local ecology might have been prior to a lot of this agricultural development. So I use multi-proxy analysis botanically. So as Alexa was pointing out at the beginning, I do starch, I do phytolith, and I do macrobotanicals. So this is me and one of my students collecting some microbotanical remains, some starch and phytolith samples from a monofragment down in the corner. And this is another my student, Destiny. We were spinning down those samples in the lab. So what can starch and phytoliths tell us? Well, starch can tell us a whole lot about tubers and carbohydrate-rich foods that people were eating in the past. Starch is really powerful in that it can tell us if something was cooked, boiled, baked, fermented, or ground, or combinations of these things. So it can tell us not only what food might have been eaten, but how that food might have been processed. Phytoliths in this case, I was only looking at domesticates. Mostly phytoliths are used for environmental questions and studies looking at environmental reconstruction. And as much as that would have been fun, I had to draw a hard line to finish my dissertation. So I only looked at domesticate phytoliths that would have otherwise been in these starch samples from artifacts instead of soil phytoliths, which would be more traditional in an environmental type study. I combine that with the study of macrobotanical remains, carbonized macrobotanical remains from the site, of course, collecting tons and tons of samples. These were processed in the field and then brought back to the lab and created lots of opportunities for student engagement and training. And it was just a lot of fun looking through those, compiling all of these data. So one of the big enduring questions I want to start with before we dive into the nitty-gritty of what I found at Blanca is this relationship between initial urbanism, between initial urbanization and maize intensification. So there's been a lot of conversations about what role maize might have played in the charging up of the first cities. Did maize intensification predate urbanization? Did maize intensification enable early urbanism? Or was it a product that we get the city and then we need maize intensification to effectively keep it going? Or because we've got all these people, now we can intensify maize. So there's all these questions and theories about the issue. Rather than testing one or the other, I like to take in my work an exploratory data analysis approach where I dive into the results and we see what the data have to say. So when I looked at maize abundance at early preclassic and middle preclassic sites, I compiled all of the available botanical data in the published record. You can see that there are huge maize abundances at sites like Aquiles Cerdan, and this is in two different periods at Aquiles Cerdan. You can see that there's huge maize abundances in terms of mean count or count divided by the number of features. And this is really interesting because early preclassic, no urbanism, right? They're not really charging up, beginnings of social stratification. And here is the middle preclassic, and La Blanca is our urban center. We're looking at this incipient urban center. So what these data really illustrate is that maize comes in quite strong by certainly the early preclassic, and people may have been intensifying it prior to the introduction of the first cities. When we look at maize ubiquity or the presence and absence of maize across the samples, you can also see another lens of this picture. So if we look at, this is organized through time. So conscious is a middle preclassic phase, and all of these are early preclassic phases. So you can see even very early on at Paso de la Amada, the Barra phase, you already have maize being quite widespread across the samples. So not only is maize quite abundant in terms of counts and amounts, but it's quite widespread in the early preclassic before the city even comes to life and comes integrated into this framework. So maize is not only widespread, it's also quite abundant before the city comes in. And when we look back at this maize abundance, you'll notice that La Blanca is quite low even in comparison to these early preclassic sites. And that doesn't mean that maize isn't there. Maize is definitely at La Blanca. But you'll see that there's another dynamic that's also driving the botanical remains from the site. And here's your first inklings of what that dynamic might be. So this is using a index of diversity used in faunal analysis and botanical analysis, the Shannon-Weaver index, whereas richness, think about it as the number of different taxa. So the number of different categories that these sorts of plants might fall into, and equitability as the distribution of counts within those categories. So a high richness value means that there's a lot of different taxa. It's quite diverse in that way. And a high equitability value means it's really evenly spread across those taxa that exist. So we can see that early preclassic, our expectations, by the way, would be that early preclassic would score quite high, at least on richness, meaning that maybe they're foraging quite a bit, they're engaging in their landscape in a different way. And one model that people have posited is that when you get to the city, that you downsize in terms of the number of different plants you might be using. Maybe you're consolidating your interests into, for example, maize, because maize is very efficient in feeding people. It produces a lot of kernels that are carbohydrate rich and calorie rich. So we can see that La Blanca falls quite rich on the scale. In other words, it has a lot of different taxa, and they're not necessarily evenly distributed, but it definitely stands out in comparison to this MPC dot, that's Cuauhtémoc, the other middle preclassic site I talked about, smaller than La Blanca in size. So that falls more in the expectation of a low richness, few things, and low equitability, kind of concentrated in certain resources. So that might be our expectation growing in if we were assuming that there is a maize-based focus. But instead, La Blanca is pulling out over here far to the right. And that creates a really interesting story. Why is this happening and what's going on? So let's look at the site a little bit closer. Like I said at the very beginning of this talk, I had the benefit of coming in on the heels of decades of excavations at the site. And those excavations have focused on several areas. The central area, and that's where Debbie Pearsall and her students have analyzed some samples from. The Hoyas area, the Vacas area, and the Esquivel area. And I went back and analyzed some more things from the central area. I've analyzed samples from all of these areas to comment very broadly on the food dynamics at the site. But the main thing to know is that there are 4 residential spaces that have been excavated over time. And there was once an extremely large mound in the central district. Unfortunately, this mound was taken down as part of a rescue excavation, as a road was scheduled to cut straight through the middle of it. So it was taken down in the 70s, and botanical samples, unfortunately, weren't taken from these excavations. But you can see in this photo, and this is an individual right here. This is a person. Oh, excuse me, that's a person. You can see from this photo just the grand scale of Mound 1. It was absolutely enormous. It was huge. So lots of big earth-moving projects being that people are participating in at this site, in addition to building acropolises and several of the other neighborhoods. So because there's a lot of houses, one of the things I wanted to do was to look at what kinds of groupings may exist between these houses. And if I could get at groupings in a quantitatively meaningful way. So I did some spatial statistics to set myself up for this. I put in all of these excavation units, which were situated on top of house mounds. And I put in the points as well as the polygons to look at things in 2 different lights. So I was really excited initially when I did this average nearest neighbor statistic. And you can see that it gave us this Z-score where there was less than a 100% likelihood that the clustered pattern could be a result of random chance, which was so exciting. So clustering is happening. There's some sort of clustering that is happening in terms of the point record. And then when I looked at the polygons and did this multidimensional spatial cluster analysis, I was able to see the size of these clusters. So what we're looking for are intersections with the confidence envelope or the confidence interval. And so what we see is that we see an intersection around 200 and we see an intersection around 400. So at this intersection around 200 and even lower than that, by around 200, we've got clusters that are about that size. By about 400, those clusters drop off. So the clusters are between 200, 400 or so in size. We're looking for those bins. So that gives us a better sense there. And now I wanted to see what do the clusters maybe look like in space. So I did a Euclidean distance calculation to try to get at clustering, what this does, and this is the best looking by far. It's really cool in terms of the colors. And it gets at these clusters, and it essentially uses these buffer zones to create these blobs of the clustered points. So the buffer zones are like at different radiuses, how big this would be. And we're looking at really this tightest one that is very interesting. If we see the size here, you can see 230 meters. Here we are. So even about 200, we're looking at here, and there's 230. The size is fitting really nicely. So what I did is, based on these relationships, I identified several neighborhoods and multi-use areas. So we've got these 5 neighborhoods, which are residential in scope. And we have one area which is, it's not necessarily appropriate to just classify it as a neighborhood, as it also is an area for some religious activities and some more complicated stuff going on. So what I did is compare these neighborhoods. So we can see, by the way, so this is satellite neighborhood south. Satellite neighborhood, it only has one. And here's satellite area north is what I called it, SAN. So when you look at this relationship between different crops grown in different neighborhoods, some interesting patterns start to emerge. So we're looking at right here, tree crops versus field crops, arboriculture and agriculture condensed. And you can see that Hoyos South neighborhood has a huge amount of tree to field crops. In fact, it's a 1-to-1. Remember how I said there's this idea that maybe maize is supporting the masses? Well, this tree to field crop ratio of 1-to-1 suggests that they're certainly engaging in more than just maize. And those resources include things like avocado, coyol. Coyol is a great source of oil. And in fact, the amount of coyol I found at the site is probably indicative of some sort of oil extraction, which would have been really useful in cooking in a place where there's not many animal oils, for example, to help with that nonstick process. Green sapote, walnut, and palms. Interestingly, the walnut is from slightly further up in elevation, and we'll talk more about some sort of exchange dynamics later. But to set the scene, one of the things that's really driven the way that I look at these results and the way that I engage with the botanical results from the site is this view of cities as having a social life much like people. Then instead of maybe looking at the beginning and collapse or looking at a catastrophic demise, maybe cities, we need to approach them as rising, having a fluorescence or a zenith, and then declining. Maybe that is catastrophic. Maybe that, as in Blanca, was more of a gradual situation. But regardless, there's a lot of value to looking at not necessarily the beginnings or the end, but this middle part where people are figuring things out, and food lets us do that. So at Blanca, if I've identified these neighborhoods, what can they tell us about time? Well, we know that it began with a pretty small occupation with several households in the southern area of the site. But by the Conscious C period, we get the growth of several other neighborhoods that have emerged, including the one that has Mound 1, this huge mound. By Conscious D, people are virtually everywhere. All neighborhoods are occupied. So Conscious D, think of it as the height of the site. So BC, revving up, C, getting bigger, D, everybody's there. 2 new neighborhoods are added. And then finally, E, we've dialed down. And there's only one. There are several households. This neighborhood was previously established during the Conscious D phase. So they're continuing this lifeway that they've got in D, and they're dialing it down as the city shuts down. And as they maybe move to other places like El Huchte, the state nearby, or somewhere else. So if we look at change over time and we think of, again, C, it's getting bigger, D is the zenith of the site, what is going on in terms of plant diversity? So if we look at change, and what this is this is a model, divers, which basically is looking at richness, remember richness being the number of different taxa present, and it's looking at it in terms of an expected confidence envelope. So if it's above the confidence envelope, then it's significantly exceeding expectations based on sample size. If it's below the confidence envelope, then it's significantly low in expectations. It does not meet expectations whatsoever. So you can see BC is very close, slightly below expectations, not far. CD is almost significantly exceeding those expectations. So in other words, at the zenith of the site, diversity is quite high in terms of richness. And at E, this last occupation, you can see that it's really low. It's very below expectations. So this is really interesting. At the time that the site is most occupied, they're engaging in and using a wide suite of resources. But even though they're using a wide suite of resources, are they still focusing on just one? Are they still focusing on just few? And so this other counterpoint of diversity, evenness, and it's called evenness in divers, it's called equitability in Shannon Weaver, the first model I showed you of diversity, but it's a similar situation where one or above the confidence interval means it's significantly evenly distributed, those counts among those categories, and below the confidence interval, it's very unevenly distributed. So we see again, BC and this revving up pretty on expectations, but CD, this very populous period, really nice, even, or at least extremely, in this case, is significantly even. It exceeds expectations, even distribution of counts between categories. And by E, we're below expectation. So not very even, not very diverse. So this dynamic of diversity seems to be very high in this most populous period. So how do we put space together with time? So here's a basic model of some of these relationships. I would say some of the most interesting relationships. And you can see that we've got a neighborhood in the north, a neighborhood in the center, a neighborhood in the south. And what you can see over time is that the roles of these neighborhoods changed. So this little yellow thing on this image represents a maize kernel. Avocado represents tree crops. And this black bit is a maize cupule, the inedible part of maize that comes off during processing. So in the earliest phase, we only have the Vaca's neighborhood of these three that's actually founded. So we've got a low amount of kernels, probably doing basic cooking activities. Kernels usually come from cooking refuse. By this middle part, by this middle phase, you see that everybody's doing a little bit of tree crops, but some neighborhoods are participating more in certain things than others. So for example, the cooking seems to be concentrated in the Vaca's neighborhood. The central neighborhood is doing some as well. And the Sohoya South neighborhood is a pretty low amount of that cooking activity. saying that the people in the Hoya South neighborhood aren't cooking in their homes. It's just in terms of the amount, it is quite low. Now, what interestingly, by this most recent period, you see that some groups even shift in their roles slightly or add on new roles. For example, the tree crops in this middle period, quite low in Hoya South. But remember how Hoya South had that huge 1-to-1 ratio of tree crops to field crops? Well, it gets the highest amount of tree crops of all the neighborhoods by this later period. So as we move on in time, it really starts to specialize in this. It starts to engage in a little bit more of maize processing, but other neighborhoods are doing that as well. And we see that Vaca's neighborhood really takes on a lot of this maize cooking. So one of the conclusions that I make from this analysis is that the roles of neighborhoods change over time, and that neighborhoods are engaging in activities that are somewhat different. They're not all doing the same thing and maybe existing autonomously. They seem to be interconnected in certain important ways. So the starch data and the phytolith data, which the phytoliths didn't produce, unfortunately, very many interesting things, the starch data can't be quantified in the same way as the macrobotanical data. So all the findings you've been hearing about are from the macrobotanical data. Nevertheless, they still provide some really interesting insights into what people were doing at the site, and they illuminate a huge array of crops that are otherwise not seen in the macrobotanical record because they're usually consumed or burned up to a crisp to the level that they're no longer identifiable. So every neighborhood but one is engaging in processing tubers, which is pretty exciting. A lot of these have grinding damage, predictably. So here's an arrowroot starch with grinding damage, these cuts along the margin. But I also have thermal damage from cooking, theoretically, as they were found in cooking pots, many of them. And so that would be this interior bubbling on the inside. One of the most interesting findings from this research is wild potato, which I didn't really expect from the outset. You don't expect potato so much in Mesoamerica. But as I dug deeper, I did find that there's a lot of potatoes that are wild from central Mexico and the Guatemalan highlands. So there's a lot of potential here that they were using these potatoes, exchanging the potatoes. They could be quite transportable. They're not everywhere. It's not an explosive amount of potatoes. But I've done a lot of comparisons with some modern potatoes that John Bamberg at USDA sent me, and they're really similar to these wild potatoes that are found in Mesoamerica. So while they're often written off as being too small or not that viable for eating these days, because there are bigger ones, certainly, that have made their way up to Mesoamerica, looks like the people of Blanca didn't really feel that way. So I just want to highlight one of these interesting relationships with potatoes in the modern day. So in Quetzaltenango, so this is up in the highlands right here, about 13% of Guatemala's potatoes come from this region. And the soils are said to be really good for and very fertile for potato growing and production. So what's interesting is that they're going up to the highlands, we know, to get obsidian, as sourcing studies have indicated. They might also be going a little bit further into the hills to get the nuts that I identified macrobotanically. They certainly should have been based on our range estimates and our elevations of where those trees would grow. So it looks like these are indicating a dynamic of exchange, even if small amounts are brought in and out. And this shouldn't be surprising to us. Societies don't live in a vacuum, people don't live in a vacuum, and exchange is inevitable. Some of the research I've been engaged with really recently is looking at the mouths of figurines at the site. Figurines are ubiquitous in La Blanca households. They are a distinctly Middle Preclassic phenomenon. And I've been scrubbing the mouths of these figurines with toothbrushes and identifying the things that came from them. And what I found is that they're not only eating very similar foods to what is found in the site in cooking pots, but they're also processed. So it seems like people are processing these foods and feeding it to these figurines. Now, whether that is to quell these inside forces that may be quite volatile, as indicated by some ethnohistoric records we came across, or whether that might be that these figurines represent ancestors and they're feeding the ancestors. It was pretty small sample size, but it creates a really interesting way of looking at things that are not typically what we would sample and finding some really interesting results. So those results are published in a Mexicon article that came out a couple months ago, if you're interested. So I want to take the last few minutes of my talk to reflect on why we even do this work to begin with. What can we do with this research and how can we make these findings count? So let's go back to what part of the site looks like today. This is a photo I showed you earlier in this talk. You'll see plantain fields everywhere, right? And these beautiful volcanoes in the background. But in this area that's now occupied by plantain fields, we once had manioc, arrowroot, wild yam, squash, coyol, and even some green sapote, some fruit trees. So fruit trees, horticultural crops, palm trees, which are still there as well. Arrowroot and manioc are all of these really interesting resources that still exist, certainly, but are not visually apparent on this landscape. One of the things that is going to happen in our future is climate change. And we have, as archaeologists, talked about how we prepare for this future and how we look to the past in that preparation. So we look at some models. Here's some models of loss of primary productivity here's our baseline, 1981 to 2010 and 2071 to 2100. So these are all three different models of this future progression. And this is our baseline. If we zoom in, and these are going to be really grainy, but you're able to see that some of the biggest net primary productivity losses, some of these biggest losses in the amount of green space are going to happen on places like the Pacific Coast right here. So this is our baseline, and we might even see you can see it's pretty neutral right here. In all three models, the Pacific Coast is going to face quite a bit of this productivity loss as the ability to adapt to these drier landscapes is compromising agricultural activities that require a lot of water, things like plantains. So how can we use archaeology to help with this pretty grim situation? One of the things that I propose in my book is that house gardens, as you can see here in this, this beautiful tourist photo of Blanca, house gardens still exist. They're everywhere. They're peppering their way in between, around, behind households. People are still growing things. And that taking some of these crops that I've identified in the past and growing them in a more thoughtful way, growing more of them, let's say, would help to definitely allow people to have a broader resource base that might help to ensure against future food shortages or food insecurity. So this is something I merely propose. Of course, shutting down agriculture is not something that's viable. It's an economic resource for everyone in this area, and it helps to keep their lights on, their water on, their roofs on. And that's not feasible. But what might be feasible is, in a small way, bringing back some of these resources, or at least increasing the growth of certain resources to facilitate and encourage this beautiful dry forested environment with a lot of richness that would have supported the people of Blanca during their most populous time. So with that, I want to thank all of these wonderful people for helping with this project, and it's been a true joy to be part of it. And thank you so much for attending and your listening, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much, Mallory, for such a wonderful talk. It's so nice to hear about your research. It's so all-encompassing for such a great research area, and all the questions you and then the broader team were asking. So it's really great. And plus, it's so impressive after decades of excavation to sort of see these really large, really rich data sets. So thank you so much. I'd like to open the floor to those of us on Zoom, and then those on Facebook Live that are listening in. Feel free to drop any questions into the comment section online. So does anyone have any questions for Dr. Melton right away? Okay, well, I'll start. It's so interesting to know that Blanca is in this really unique ecosystem, this environment, this sort of dry forest environment. And I was curious about the kind of conceptualization, not only of the project, but kind of the ways in which you're querying the data sets, kind of theoretically and kind of factoring in ideas like niche construction and the ways in which people are pulled into these ecosystems, and whether kind of urbanization is always going to be the sort of end product, or it becomes the end product because of the ways in which people are not compelled, but kind of encouraged by these sort of non-human plant, or not non-human species to sort of direct people's daily activities, and it kind of loops people in and keeps them within these relationships for decades and for centuries. So I was curious how niche construction and ideas of kind of the non-human factored into the conceptualization of the project, and then how, again, this really great spatial analysis that you've been doing for your work.
That's a really interesting point and a really exciting one. I think a lot of the places that we think of as being urban spaces in Mesoamerica have certainly been places that support agriculture and support a lot of rich and diverse plant life for hundreds of years. I mean, Tikal, right? Really rich landscape. La Blanca, really rich landscape. And not saying like a Mazatlan maybe wasn't, but it's one of the things that maybe you're right, maybe encourage people to come in. And I wish one of the analyses that we've thought of, but it's very difficult to get permissions for things like this these days, but to do strontium analysis in some of the human remains. And they're also super, super fragmentary. They're very, very crumbly. But it would be really interesting to see where these people are coming from at La Blanca, and how they're getting there, where they're coming from in the region. Are they coming maybe for these rich resources? And we know even in the Aztec period that the Pacific coast is one of these rich landscapes for a lot of things, namely cacao, which everyone gets excited. They're like, oh, you have to have found cacao. And I didn't. And I'm sorry, everybody. And I wish. Even when I was looking at El Ajuste, the state that comes afterwards, I've got like 2 pieces that are like cacao CF, and that's the best I could get. Compares favorably, maybe cacao. But to build on that point, I think it truly is and has been a rich landscape, and that's why it's so good for agriculture today, and that we shouldn't underestimate its potential in the past. So maybe it is inspiring these people to come together. Maybe it is inspiring these people to make a living here, because La Blanca is occupied fairly consistently. We don't think there are any periods of abandonment and coming back for hundreds of years. So the thought going into this project was, how do they make it work for so long, right? And then maybe what can we learn from them to make it work today? So I think that's a really good point. I think maybe the plants are convincing the people in some subtle ways.
Yeah, or like kind of pulling them into these relationships that they choose or maybe can't get out of, choose to continue to participate in, or they can, like, again, sort of these exchanges and networks that are formed by that, right? And it becomes kind of a shorthand. People are that they move on and they're fundamentally changed, right, by these relationships. No, it's great. It's such an interesting question. Plus, like, dry forest ecosystem is so fascinating, just because of what it can offer and the set of differences, especially with the rest of this landscape that you've pointed out is so humid, and so it's the sort of novelty of this environment is really interesting, right? Like, so anyways, I won't continue babbling, but anyone
No,
else on Zoom
very cool.
anyone else on Zoom have any questions? Go ahead, Julia.
Thanks, Alexa. Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Melton. This was a fascinating talk. I really like the way that you're really trying to address these big anthropological questions with your research, and then tying that very directly to problems that we're facing as a human species in the contemporary world. So kudos to you for that. My question, so I have a few questions. Definitely, your talk was super evocative, super like definitely brought up so many interesting questions for me. The first thing that I wanted to ask was, so I work in the Cusco region on Inca state formation, and my dissertation research mainly focused on survey, so I didn't get a chance to do any excavation, but I've been really curious, especially from working with local communities in the area, about the exploitation of wild plant species and how that could complement agriculture as well. And so I was just curious. I know you mentioned about wild potatoes, but I was wondering how you see change in exploitation of wild plant species over the course of occupation.
Yeah, this is a great question. So when going into this research, again, like I said, some of these models in the literature are very agriculturally focused and very like, we have to build it all from square one, right? The anthropogenic landscapes is the way to go. And it was really exciting and shocking and thrilling to find that at this most populous period, they're engaging in all these foraged resources. They're basically using foraged resources to fill the gap rather than agricultural resources. And I don't want to I think sometimes we're tempted to do this either or, like their forage focus or their agricultural focus. They're doing it all, but they're using this broad base and they're using these wild resources. Certainly during the most populous period. So that's when you do get the most explosion of this foraging dynamic. And part of the argument I have is that, of course, they're used to the area, they're getting to know it a lot more. Of course, it would expand that way, but it certainly seems like they're filling in some gaps that way that they may have had as the population grew and expanded.
Okay, that's super cool. Thanks for your response. And then my other question was whether you can speak to a little bit more about the factors that contribute to the decline of an urban settlement.
Yeah, so this is a hot topic, of course, in the literature over the last 20 years, right? As many of us, I think, pull back the gas on the term collapse and think more broadly about decline, disintegration, things like that. So I taught this class this semester on ancient cities, and it had me, so this is all like very fresh in my mind as we were talking about these things. I would say in the case of Blanca, there's not a catastrophic type event that causes this shutdown. There's not a poisoning of the water source, drought, something like that. And I didn't see when I did my radiocarbon dates, for example, for the dissertation, there wasn't these kind of like values that are screaming at me in the carbon that like something's up, something's wrong with the maize. That doesn't mean that there aren't fluctuations. So Hector Neff has, of course, done a lot of great research looking at these climatic fluctuations and has pointed out some over time as well. It's just that the cards aren't lining up, that there was some big sack of La Blanca, some falling apart. It makes sense that what happened was they were dialing down activities there bit by bit. One neighborhood is occupied at this latest period as they're dialing up activities in this state that's like 14 kilometers away, El Ajuste, which is, it's not necessarily that it goes directly from one period to the other, that they're abutting one another. There may be a gap in between them, but it's tempting to think that maybe they're just moving on to something else, something different, or they're moving elsewhere. So I think that we have to embrace the idea of decline as being a natural thing that is going to happen at one point. Not everything lasts forever. we don't have the iPhone 1 still around, but that there's also this case that decline might be multifactorial. There might be a lot of things going into it, even if we find that one thing is catastrophic. Like, for instance, researchers David Lentz and other colleagues at Tikal have found that the water sources at Tikal had a lot of heavy metals in them, which may poison those water sources. But can we say from that poison water source equals people get poisoned, equals people die, people leave Tikal? I think the disintegration of Tikal is much more complex in terms of the political elements and the social elements, in addition to the practical elements like getting poisoned by your water source. So I think we have to look broadly. We have to not settle, and we have to think that inevitably decline is going to happen. Nothing lasts forever.
I also have a
Oh, yeah, go ahead,
question.
Adriana.
Well, first a comment and then a question. So I'm a Maya-zooarchaeologist, right? And so I always like to hear from what I consider to be the other side of the food waste, like the people who do all the plants and things like that, because there's so few of you. So it's always great to hear more new research. But I love that there's this, so this is my comment, but I love that there's this component of foraging of wild plants that you can see. Because if we think about zooarchaeologically, like the majority of the animals that, the different indigenous groups in Mesoamerica acquired are not domesticated, right? They are hunting and fishing and foraging for most of these animals. And so to me, like the idea that like, oh, you spend only your time in fields and then, oh, you're going to go on a hunting trip. It's like, but a lot of foraging can involve both activities as well. Or you can, like from a zooarchaeology perspective, like maybe you go forage for your plants and, oh, you encounter an animal, right? So this assumption that they're like strongly agricultural, of course they are, but there are so many other activities that they can engage in. And I love that your research showcases like those possibilities. So just love it. That's my comment. But otherwise, I do have a question. It's technical, but I was just curious, like when you were showing the figurines and you were, I guess, removing or finding phytolith, I was just wondering, how do you go about doing that? Like technically, like without damaging the figurine, right? Like how do you recover these phytoliths?
Yeah, so thank you for your comment, first of all. And one of the things I should say is that, we can only talk about so much in this sphere, but Tom Wake has done, at UCLA, has done the faunal analysis for this site. One of the interesting things is that the site even today has a lot of lagunetas, these like little ponds that could have supported fish life and other sorts of plant life, of course, that means that, again, breaks down this dynamic of, does foraging mean that they're going out on a huge mission very far, that they're using all these resources? Maybe that foraging happens quite locally, right?
Yeah.
In these beautiful landscapes that allow for plants and animals to be taken. So to answer your question about the figurines, yeah, so it's the scientific, unscientific method. I know it's very scientific, but of scrubbing the figurines with toothbrushes. So what I did is I took I take 3 sediments, usually from an artifact, a dry brush, a wet manual toothbrush, and a wet sonicating toothbrush. And I do that to do a kind of stratigraphy of the sedimentation, get closer to the artifact. Usually you find your most sediments in the wet toothbrush, or find your most results in the wet toothbrush. That's sediment 2. So for the figurines, I took the dry brush of the entire head. So I brushed the entire head to see what outside of the mouth might be on the figurine. And then I use the wet toothbrush and the sonicating toothbrush to brush just the mouth. So one of the great things is that I didn't find anything on the heads, which was what you want, right? Find nothing. Awesome. like I said, this paper that I published is a pretty small sample size. It's not a huge one, so we had to, zone it down or tailor it down that maybe it's not all the figurines are being fed, but certainly some of them seem to be. And it's all these things that we don't expect to contaminate. I didn't find like massive amounts of maize. There was some maize, and this maize has some really great grinding damage on it, these radiating lines. But there's things like yams, wild tubers. We don't expect those sorts of things to be things that are on people's hands that are touching them. So mostly I sampled figurines that were coming right out of the field from the 2016 and 2017 excavations because I was there. But I also sampled some washed figurines, and I'll say that I also got some great results from the washed figurines. So don't lose hope for washed things. Just realize you might not get the recovery that you would get with taking something right out of the field. So basically, you scrub them with toothbrushes, use these wash bottles in the background to rinse those toothbrushes into centrifuge tubes, like 50 milliliter tubes, close up the tubes, duct tape the top, wrap it in plastic wrap, get it off into the US. The main thing in this area is so starches begin to gelatinize or break down. That's what causes your pasta water to be gummy, for example. They gelatinize at about 40, 50 Celsius, depending on the species. So in this area, you have to really make sure that you're keeping the samples somewhere that is quite temperate, because it gets up to 40 Celsius and like by April. And so you imagine that effect of a dog being in a hot car. It gets warmer in that car. It gets warmer in that wrapped package. So you really do have to make sure to not artificially gelatinize your starches. But if you're interested in taking samples like this, like I have tons of protocols I've written for other people, and I'd be happy to help.
Yeah, thank you. It's just, when I saw the photo with the toothbrush, I was just like, I really wonder how this works because I've never done this, right? So fascinating. And yeah, just to go back to your comment about the little like lagunitas or whatever, like, yeah, I totally agree. I don't think people have to go very far to acquire the resources that they need. I mean, I worked at Lamanai, the lagoon is right next to the site, and they're definitely acquiring fish and turtles from this lagoon. Like they don't have to go far to get the things that they need. But I think that they are, like you were saying, like using a good amount of their environment, they're modifying the landscape in a way that is useful to them, right? So thank you.
And they don't have to start from scratch effectively, right? They don't have to just do maize. They've got a lot at their disposal.
Yes.
Great, thanks so much. Do we have any other questions from those of us on Zoom? I don't see any questions on Facebook, but I'm sure there'll be interactions with the video after it's posted. Patty, I don't know, you've turned your video on. Did you want to make any comments or questions, or are you okay?
No, thank you, Mallory, for sharing. It was an amazing talk. Thank you so much for that. And thank you for all the detail.